अस्सलाम वालेकुम। मेरी आवाज़ आ रही है क्लियर? ठीक है, जज़ाकल्लाह। Okay, today's topic is object oriented programming, introduction to object oriented programming. The reason why we do object oriented programming is that in our normal procedural programming we have usually the data and the functions which act on that data are separate. Okay, so what happens is that in real world we have real objects and we have to model those objects, and those objects contain functions as well as data. For example, let's take an example of a bank account which we are going to discuss today. In the bank account, usually what we have like a we deposit some money in the bank, and then we perform some functions on that amount, such as we want to know how much is the balance. Then we want to know that whether we want to deposit any more amount in the account, or we want to withdraw, or we want to transfer to some other account, something like that. So what we are going to do is that usually the bank account has the data associated with it, such as how much is the amount, how much is the interest paid, or how much is the interest earned, or something like that. And then it also has the functions associated with it. So what happens in procedural languages, which we have done so far in all these months, is that in procedural languages the functions and the data are usually separate. So what we do is, let's say if we are going to make a simple bank account for many customers, so what would happen is that we would have, let me draw it somewhere else. Okay, so let's say we want to make several bank accounts for several customers. So what we would do is that we will declare a variable. Let's say it's a double type variable. Okay, and sorry, and let's say it's a double type variable, and we call it the double customer one. Okay, sorry for bad writing. Customer one. And then what we do is, let's say we have another customer. So what we do, we declare another variable, double customer two. Okay, sorry for bad writing. And then we just keep on declaring these variables, so that these variables, they correspond to different customers. And then we create some functions. Let me write it down, those functions for you. Let's say, because this thing is causing problem. So take note. Okay, so the usual things would happen, that if I include IO stream, and using namespace standard. I mean, these things are now pretty much everyone knows them. Okay, then we just say return 0. And then what we do is, let's say we have a customer one, and we just declare a double customer one. So this variable corresponds to the bank account of customer one, and then we just keep on doing and declaring these variables, double customer two, and this variable corresponds to customer two, and we just keep on going. And so let's say we declare double customer 100, and this corresponds to the 100 customer the bank has. Now what we do is that we declare functions, and when we declare those functions, as for example, void deposit double a. For the, I mean, this function, what this function would do is that it will add the amount whatever way we want to any of these customers. And then we can have void withdraw double a, and this function would withdraw or subtract any amount from these variables. And just stick with me, I'm going to explain why this approach is actually problematic. And let's say we have a function display balance. Okay, and it just declares it just displays whatever the values of these variables are. The problem is that if we have like 100 variables and they are accessed by just 3 functions, so it is actually possible that these variables are mistakenly accessed by function. Let's say I want to access customer number 4 and I access customer number 14. Since the problem is that these variables are globally accessible by any function, because we have defined these variables in the main function, and we are publicly, I think these variables are actually publicly accessible by any of these functions, because we are going to pass the values there, and they what they are going to do is that they are going to deposit or withdraw or display the balance, whatever that might be. The problem is that the mistaken access by functions to the variables which we don't want. Let's say we want to change the value for customer 5, and we change the value for, and in code writing actually, and we change the value for customer number 15. So that might create a problem. So what actually happened was that in the I mean how this object oriented programming came about was that there was something known as a structure or struct in traditional C language, which was a precursor to C++ language. And what they did was that they grouped all the data concerned with the object in one entity. For example, if you are talking about, let's say we are talking about books, and we want to store data for several books, what we can do is, because books have each book has a title, it has an author, it has a subject, and it might have some kind of an ISBN number, which we call book ID, or you can just search what ISBN is. That's actually a globally trackable unique number for each book published anywhere in the world. But the problem is that if we declare the variables, or if we declare those strings, such as if we declare those arrays, for example, and we say title book 1, and we just declare an array, and we say author book 1 and subject book 1 and book ID book 1, it becomes really tedious to maintain that data, because we have to keep in mind that what variable corresponds to which book. Now the language designers came up with the idea of something known as a struct or a structure. They have declared a struct. Look, the thing to remember is that we do not this part of this structure is not part of our course, but it is actually an introduction to this object-oriented programming, which I'll be coming back in a few minutes. So what the language designers did was they declared some kind of a structure, and we just declared like this struct books, and we declare all these variables which are associated with the books. Now, how do we declare a book object? So what we do is we just declare struct books book 1. So that means that book 1 is kind of a complex or a compound variable, if you want to think of it, or it's actually a container which contains title, author, subject, and book ID. Okay, and book 2 is a separate entity which is of type books. Okay, the type books, and it contains its own title, author, subject, and book ID. So let me draw it down for you, that title, author, subject, book ID. We can think of book 1. Sorry, book. What happened here? Okay, book 1 as a container. Okay, and book 2 as another container. The book 1 contains title, author, subject, and book ID. So book 1 contains title, author, and subject, and ID. Okay, and book 2 also contains its own title, author, subject, and book ID. Sorry for bad writing, but you can imagine book 1 and book 2 as two separate containers which contain their own variables. Okay, now if we want to access those variables, what we are going to do is we say, look, we want to have the title for book 1, because it's actually a character, it's a null terminated byte string, so it's kind of an array. So we are using the string header file, and it has a string copy. What it's going to do is it's going to copy this string in book1.title. Okay, and it's going to copy this string in book1.author, and this dot operator is actually an access operator. So what we are saying that, look, go to this book 1 entity or object, and in that container you will see a variable title. Copy this thing into that variable or array. And then in the third line, we say book1 dot subject. We just saying that whatever string is here, we are copying it here. Okay. And in the last line, we are saying that book1 dot book id equals to this value or some ISBN number. Okay. And we do the same thing to book2. We want to access book2 dot title. We want to access book2 dot author. We can just use the string copy command. And if you want to access some integer or double value of any, we just use the normal assignment operator to assign this number to book2 dot book id. Now if I want to print these couts and book1 and book2 things, so we are using normal cout statements. Make sure, and it displays that book1 title is this thing, book1 author, I mean this is made of these titles, and book2 title is this thing, and book2 author and book2 subject and book2 id is this thing. The problem is that I mean, I'm coming to the problem in a moment, that we use these variables. The variable name is now slightly different. We are not using title1, author1 or subject1. We are saying, look, book2 is the object name, and dot operator, we are using the dot operator to access whatever is the publicly accessible variable within that container, which is title. And now we are accessing the author variable or the array. We are accessing the subject array, and now we are accessing the book id variable, which is associated with this book2 entity. And if we want to access the book1 entity variables or arrays or anything contained in there, we are going to use the dot operator as defined here. Now, this thing was further developed into classes. What happened is that coming back to क्या लिखा है ये recording तो हो रही है अच्छा coming back to this thing, actually the problem is that these functions, I mean these functions can access these functions are the string copy function or the cout object or modifier or string modifier. They can access these variables which are contained within these containers, and we have the same problem, but we have solved one of the problem is that we have a container which has the associated data concerned with that container. Let's say we are talking about book1, so we have all the associated data contained in book1 object. And let's say we are talking about book2, we have all the concerned data within book2 object or book2 entity or container, whatever you want to call it. This thing simplifies the data management, but the problem remains that any function can access these variables, and they can inadvertently or mistakenly modify these variables. So what happened next is that the language designers, whatever language designer of C++ and other object-oriented languages, they came up with the concept of something known as classes and objects. So the difference between a structure and object, or the difference between a structure and class, I'm going to explain that, is that the objects will now contain the data as well as the functions within the same container. In the structure example, only the containers only contain the data but not the functions. In the classes, the containers will contain the data as well as the functions within the same container. So what we are going to do is, now we are going to use the example of a bank account. I'm going to explain it at least twice. So the experience is that whenever I explain this example, usually in the first try, some students get it, but some students do not. So in the next try, you will get it, inshallah. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm writing a class definition. The name of this class definition is bank account. Okay, this class definition starts at this curly bracket and ends at this curly bracket, and we have a semicolon right next to it. Okay, so this class definition contains a variable. The name of this variable is balance. Okay, this is an account balance associated with a bank account, and the type of this variable is double. I'm going to explain what this private and public mean in a moment. Okay, and then this class definition contains a code for a function. Okay, for a function, a special type of function which we call a constructor. And if you can notice that the name of this function is the same as the name of the class. Okay, and what it does is it will I'm going to call this function and I'm going to explain that. Okay, then this class definition, the bank account class definition, I'm talking about the class definition, contains a function. The name of this function is deposit. It's not returning any value, but it's taking a value, some number, and it's adding to whatever is the existing balance and updating the balance variable. The balance variable is given here. Then this class definition also contains the function which we call withdraw, and it's not returning any value, and it's taking an argument, a parameter, and it's subtracting that parameter or whatever value is passed to from the balance and updating the value of the balance. And the last function in this class definition is display. Display function is not taking any value, it's not returning any value, and it's not expecting any value. It's just displaying whatever the balance is. Now this class definition is actually, you can imagine this thing as a map of a building. Okay, a map which we call naksha, a map of a building. Actually, you cannot live in a map, you can only live in a building, an actual well, an actual structure, if you want to call it. Okay, so what we are going to do is this class definition, it's not going to do anything by itself. This is important. The class definition is not going to do anything by itself. We have to declare an object. We have to declare an object, like here we say that how we declare any variable. We just write, for example, we just write integer a equals to 10, and that's how we declare a variable of type integer. The name of that variable is a, and the value of that variable is 10. So if we want to declare an object of this class type, so we just write the type of this class or the name of the class. We say, look, bank account ba1, and then we pass the value 100. So whenever an object is created of this type, whenever the object is created of this type, and we can say a name for it. Let's say we want to create another object. We just say bank account, the name of the class. Okay, and with the name of the object here, let's call it ba2, and we just say like 200.00 if you want to call it. So this will create another object of the same type, the same class, based on the same class definition, and the name of that object is ba2. Okay, so what we are going to do is that whenever we create an object, the name of that object is ba1. So what happens is that whenever an object is created, the constructor function is called. Okay, the constructor function, that is called only once at the time of the object creation or object construction. So it will pass the value 100, and this 100 will be stored in the variable balance. Okay, so let me draw it down for you. If I have let's try with paint, because this thing. Okay, so we have the class definition name is bank account. Okay, but this bank account class definition itself doesn't do anything. It's only a, you can just call it a map or a blueprint for some other thing which is going to be constructed based on this definition. So what we actually created, where is the real action is, the name of that object is ba1. So ba1 has a private variable, and that variable is balance. Okay, and it has several functions. It has, obviously it's going to have a constructor function, but this constructor function is only going to be called once when the object is created, so I'm not writing that. The main functions are deposit, withdraw, and display. So the main function, let's close that. So the main function is deposit and round brackets, and the other function is withdraw, and the third function is display. Actually it has a fourth function, but it has it. Okay, so this ba1 is an object which contains data. Data is this balance. Okay, and it contains the associated functions. Then in the next line, in this line, we created another object ba2 based on the same class definition. So this ba2 So this BA2, let me pick some other color. Let's blue color. Okay. So this BA2 is another object stored somewhere else in the memory, and it will have a private variable balance. It will have its own function deposit. It will have its own function withdraw, and it will have its own function display. Okay, so now we are talking two objects. So let's say BA1 corresponds to customer 1 and BA2 corresponds to customer number 2. And let's say we declare another object, just like we declare some variables. Let's say we have customer number 3, and we say bank account. The type of that customer is bank account, and the name of that customer, let's call it BA3, and let's say the balance is 500. Okay, so now we have another object BA3. So let me draw that object somewhere else in the memory. Okay, so now you get the idea. So BA3 is another object. It will contain balance, the private variable. It will contain its own deposit function. It will contain its own withdraw function. Sorry for bad writing, because I'm writing it quickly and I'm writing in paint, so it's not a good software. Okay, and it will contain its own function, which we call display. Okay, so now we have three objects. Each object has its own balance variable. Each object it has its own function. Each object has its own all the functions contained within that object, and all of these objects are defined based on the class definition. Okay, so that's important thing to remember. The first thing to remember itself, the class definition itself doesn't do anything. All the action happens in objects. So once you create those objects, now you have something to work with. Now you have some area in the memory in which some data structure has been created along with the associated functions, and those data structure or some data members, which you call them, or these member functions associated with them, are now contained within a single container, which we call an object. Now we have three containers: BA1, BA2, and BA3. So the value for this BA1, the value for when we created this object using this line. Okay, so this 100 value is passed to opening balance, and opening balance is associated, is assigned to balance. Okay, so the value for this balance is now 100, and I think this is now 500, and balance 2 was 200. Okay, once we created those objects. Now the next thing to remember is that we have declared using a keyword private with a colon. This is not a semicolon, this is a colon, two dots. Okay, and this is right next to or up of a semicolon, so you have to press shift and press colon. Okay, private is a something known as which we call should I write it somewhere? This is known as an access modifier, or some people call it an access controller. Okay, many names for it. What it does is that what we call the private information. Let's say your private information is whenever you're opening a bank account. Okay, so usually something, let's say, what is the name of your first pet, or what is the name of your some distant relative or something like that. I mean, that is anything which you know and other people don't know, which we call something known as a private information. Anything which you know obviously and other people also know, which we call something known as an publicly accessible information. Usually the mother's maiden name is private information. Not many people know the maiden name of mothers. Okay, so that is usually used for opening the bank account or accessing the bank account in case you lost access to it. Okay, so in this case, this private means it's an access modifier, and we can have many variables here. Okay, we can have integer a, for example, or integer or short c, for example, or many variables here, and all of these variables are listed next to the access modifier private. I'm going to remark that because you're going to use those variables, but they can be listed. Okay, so these variables or whatever you list, you can have multiple functions here as well. Okay, so whatever you list after this keyword private are not accessible outside this container. Okay, so main function Even though we in the main function we created bank account and we write ba1 and we write 100. Even though we created a ba1 object, it exists in the main function, but this main function cannot access the balance of these objects, the balance variable, because the balance variable has been declared as a private variable. Okay, so the concept here is, I mean, let me recap what we have discussed so far, because we are just going to discuss this single code only. The concept was, in the procedural languages, usually we have the data and function separately, and if we have like thousands of customers and each customer has a variable, and we are writing a program for the management of some bank, or software for some bank. So what, in the normal procedural languages, we would have declared like thousands of variables corresponding to thousands of customers account balances. The problem was that each those variables were globally accessible. There was no data integrity or data security in programming terms. I'm not talking about hacking or something like that, but in programming terms. Okay, so any function or any code can access those variables, and there could have been a mistake in accessing those variables. Let's say we want to access or change the balance of customer number 50, and we might change the, I mean, in writing the code, we might change the instead of customer 50, we might change to customer 15. Now in this object oriented programming, we created a class definition and we declared a variable, or variables, usually they are private, and those private variables are not accessible by anything outside these containers. So that means that these variables, these are private variables, this balance is a private variable, they are only accessible by the functions or by the variables which are within the container. Okay, which are within the container. So this is private information. Okay, so what we can do is, okay, now coming to the next keyword, then we are going to explain how this action works. The next keyword here is public. Okay, the next keyword here is public, and whatever we list, and we have a colon here, not a semicolon, so watch out, and whatever we list after this keyword is publicly accessible by anything outside these containers. So we have a bank account, a constructor function, a special kind of function which create the objects taking in the starting values if you want to. If you do not want these constructor functions, no problem at all, you can just create any kind of other function if you want to, but it's a good practice actually. We can have multiple constructors here. Okay, with different arguments, whatever you want to create. Okay, so in this function, deposit function, withdraw function, and display function, they are defined within the same container. So this deposit function, withdraw function, display function can access balance function, sorry, balance variable, not function. Okay, and these deposit, withdraw, and display functions, since they are defined publicly, so they are actually callable by the main function. Okay, or they are callable by anything outside the container. So that means that this object can main function can call the deposit function, the main function can call the withdraw function, and the main function can call the display function. Other functions or other objects can also call these functions. The reason is because these functions are publicly accessible. And why they are publicly accessible? Because we have defined them after this access modifier public. Okay, so let's coming back to here, and how we can access the member functions of these objects. So we have cout before transactions, and we want to access the display function of the ba1 object. Okay, so the ba1 object, what we are going to do is that ba1 dot display. So this dot operator enables us to access any publicly accessible functions or variables. Let's say it contain, let's say if I have a variable public and I write, I mean, this is just a comment, if I write integer a equals to, for example, 20. So every object will have the publicly accessible variable integer a, and the value of that would be 20. So if I want to access that a, so what I'm going to do is, since it's publicly accessible, watch out, since it's publicly accessible, so I can write ba1 dot a sorry, a equals to 25. So I mean, this dot operator enables us to access anything contained in that container which is publicly accessible. So I'm going to remark this line, and I'm going to, where is that line? I'm going to remark this line as well. So what happens is now, because we are running out of time, so let's see. So this ba1 dot display, it displays whatever the current balance is. Then we call this function deposit function, and we say look at 74.35. So the balance would now be 174.35. So the deposit function definition is given here. I'm just reading the definition, but watch out that action is not happening here. The action is not happening in the class definition. The action is actually happening within the object container. So this deposit function is defined within the object container, the withdraw function is defined within the object container, and the display function is defined within the object container. So you can imagine whatever code is written within the class definition is actually copy pasted. You can just imagine, is actually, I mean, the actual management is slightly different, but you can just imagine that whatever code written in the class definition is actually copy pasted in the BA1 object, as well as the BA3 object, as well as the BA2 object. So we are saying, look, deposit this much amount. So this much amount is whatever the amount, 170. The amount would now be, the balance would be 74.35, and we say withdraw 20. So the amount would be 154.35. So if I run this code, and we again call the display function. So if I run this code, it says that the before transaction the balance is this line happens here, and after transaction the balance is 154.35. We can do the same thing with BA2 and BA3 and any other object based on this class definition. So the point is that the balance variable is now only privately accessible. So what happens is now we have less chances of error. And now our code and our object definitions, based on class definitions, obviously, these class definitions now reflect our real world much more closely. And now we have less chances of the code corruption. So that, because if I want to access BA1, I'm going to call the functions of BA1 object. If I want to call, let's say, BA2, so I'm going to call BA2 dot display, and I'm say, look, whatever the display, I mean, whatever the amount is, display that. And if I say BA, sorry, and if I say, like, if I want to deposit some amount, I'm going to say BA2. I'm going to call the function of BA2 object, and I'm say add 50, whatever the amount is. And since it's double, so I'm going to write 50.00. And if I want to withdraw, so I'm just going to say BA2 dot withdraw, and I'm say withdraw 25.00. So in that scenario, so since I'm calling the actual object, I'm calling the object, I'm calling the functions associated with an object, and those functions are now accessing the private variable. So there is less chances of inadvertent or mistaken correction of data by the code. This explanation will further continue in some recorded lecture. हाँ हाँ, अटेंडेंस हो रही है. अच्छा, सबर करो. क्या लिखा है यार मुदस्सिर ने? कमिंग संडे को सीपी का क्विज 2. यार ये मैं इसका जवाब देता हूँ पहले. लेट मी टेक द अटेंडेंस. वो हाँ रीशेड्यूल हो जाएगा. इट्स नॉट अ बिग प्रॉब्लम. ठीक है, एक मिनट, ठहरो ठहरो ठहरो. सब आ गए. 105 10. अभी कम क्यों हो गई है? वेट. अच्छा, डेस्कटॉप सेव और HTML. ठीक है. अच्छा, सिंस नहीं, हाँ ये सही है ना अहमद, ये बैंक अकाउंट जो, अच्छा अटेंडेंस हो गई, जिसको जाने वो जाए, बाकी लोग यहाँ चैट रूम में मुझसे लिखते रहे, मैं इसका जवाब देता रहूंगा. ठीक है. बैंक अकाउंट, हाँ ये बिल्कुल कैपिटल लेटर्स मना नहीं है. कैपिटल लेटर्स आर नॉट मना नहीं है, क्योंकि मैंने इसका नाम ये रखा था. अगर आप चाहो तो फिर आप यहाँ पे स्मॉल भी कर दो, इसको भी ये कर दो. लेकिन यूजुअली होता है ये कि हमारे जो प्रोग्रामिंग कन्वेंशंस होते हैं उसमें जो हमारी अपनी टाइप डेफिनेशंस होती हैं, ठीक है, ये एक तरह की टाइप डेफिनेशन समझ लो. सही है. जो क्लास बैंक अकाउंट हमने लिखा था यहाँ पे, सॉरी यहाँ पे मुझे करना चाहिए था बी और ए, ये यूजुअली जो हमारी अपनी डेफिनेशंस होती हैं ये हम यूजुअली कैपिटल लेटर्स के साथ लिखते हैं. व्हाटएवर क्लास, व्हाटएवर टाइप डेफिनेशंस यू आर राइटिंग इट योरसेल्फ, जस्ट टू डिस्टिंग्विश इट बिटवीन डिस्टिंग्विश इट फ्रॉम दी डेफिनेशंस डिफाइंड इन दी सी प्लस प्लस इटसेल्फ, जो उनकी अपनी डेफिनेशंस हैं, अपनी टाइप्स हैं, उससे डिस्टिंग्विश करने के लिए हम यूजुअली कैपिटल लेटर्स का इस्तेमाल करते हैं। केस सेंसिटिव है, देखो यहाँ पे लिखा हुआ है बी और ये, अगर मैं यहाँ पे ये लिखता बी और ए, एरर दे देता। एरर क्यों देता? वो ये कहता कि भाई ये तो टाइप डिफाइन ही नहीं है, क्योंकि हमने तो नाम कुछ और रखा हुआ है। इस केस सेंसिटिव होने का ये मतलब है कि ये डिफरेंट चीज है और ये डिफरेंट चीज है, लेकिन केस सेंसिटिव होने का ये मतलब नहीं है कि हम कैपिटल लेटर्स इस्तेमाल नहीं कर सकते। हम कैपिटल लेटर बिल्कुल इस्तेमाल कर सकते हैं, लेकिन अब कैपिटल लेटर में अगर कोई वर्ड लिखा हुआ है और स्मॉल लेटर में कोई वर्ड लिखा हुआ है, इवन एक लेटर का भी फर्क है। जैसे पासवर्ड में होता है, पासवर्ड में आपने एक कैपिटल लेटर लिख दिया या एक स्मॉल लेटर लिख दिया, पासवर्ड डिफरेंट हो जाएगा। ठीक है, जैसे अगर आपके पासवर्ड में लेटर फॉर एग्जांपल आपके पास है कोई भी लेटर क्यू है, क्यों फॉर एग्जांपल क्यू, ओके, अब क्यू आप स्मॉल लिखें और कैपिटल लिखें, ऑब्वियसली पासवर्ड डिफरेंट हो जाएगा। जैसे पासवर्ड केस सेंसिटिव होते हैं, इस तरह हमारी टाइप डेफिनेशन और वेरिएबल्स के नाम और ऑब्जेक्ट के नाम ये सब केस सेंसिटिव है। अच्छा, सिंस ये क्या लिखा हुआ है, व्हाट विल बी द आउटर रिवर्स स्ट्रिंग प्रोग्राम, या रिवर्स स्ट्रिंग प्रोग्राम में फॉर एग्जांपल मैंने एक स्ट्रिंग दिया एनईडी, ठीक है, तो इसका रिवर्स स्ट्रिंग क्या होगा, उल्टा लूप चला दो तो उसका होगा ये हो जाएगा, एनईडी से वो डीईएन बन जाएगा। ठीक है, और कोई सवाल है किसी को, एनी मोर क्वेश्चंस? अच्छा, ये इसने जो पूछा था मुदस्सिर ने, यार ये क्विज जो है ना ये ऑनलाइन रहेगा, ठीक है, आप मंडे ट्यूसडे को कर लो, कोई मसला नहीं है। सही है, मंडे मंडे को 10 मुहर्रम है, नहीं क्या लिखा हुआ है इसने, संडे को 10 मुहर्रम है, 9-10 मुहर्रम को तो ऑब्वियसली छुट्टी, हाँ वो बंद होते हैं। तो आप मंडे को कर लेना, मंडे या मेरे ख्याल में ट्यूसडे तक कर लेना। वो आगे वाले क्विजेस चेंज नहीं होंगे, उनकी उनकी डेट्स तो चेंज नहीं हो रही, लेकिन जिन लोगों को ऑब्वियसली इंटरनेट तो जाहिर है सभी का ही बंद हो जाता है, तो वो इवन वायरलेस इंटरनेट सबसे पहले ही बंद होते हैं। तो संडे को है ना वो, आप कोई इशू नहीं है, क्विज आपका ऑनलाइन रहेगा। आप उसकी जो डेडलाइन होगी वो मैं ट्यूसडे तक कर दूंगा, ट्यूसडे को कोई भी टाइम होगा वो तुम देख लेना, मतलब आपको कोई मसला नहीं होगा, इंशाल्लाह आप कर लेना उसको। ओपी इज रियली डिफिकल्ट, नहीं यार डिफिकल्ट वो मसला ये पहली दफा आप लोग पढ़ रहे हो इस वजह से होता है। इसकी ज्यादा डिटेल जो है आपके डेटा स्ट्रक्चर एल्गोरिथम के कोर्स में आएगी, और इवन दो ये जो मैंने कोड लिया है ये वाला बैंक अकाउंट का, ये डेटा स्ट्रक्चर एल्गोरिथम की जो बुक है उसके पहले चैप्टर का पहला कोड है, ये चक्कर है। तो वो सर मिड्स के मार्क वो तो सर इकबाल बताएंगे मुझे, क्या मुझे नहीं पता, सर इकबाल ने अनाउंस नहीं करे क्या मिड के नंबर, मुझे नहीं पता, यहाँ पे आने चाहिए। इसका मिड के नंबर मुझे नहीं पता, ये सर इकबाल के ही वो है। और कोई सवाल? नहीं यार 24 डेडलाइन थी, क्या क्या मतलब है 24 क्यों, 24 आज क्या डेट है, 25 हो गई है। नहीं 24 डेडलाइन थी। बैकलॉग की अटेंडेंस मिसिंग है सर? नहीं इट्स नॉट, बैकलॉग की अटेंडेंस मिसिंग है। अच्छा हाँ, इंपॉर्टेंट सुन लो, देखो अटेंडेंस तुम लोगों के पोर्टल पे आ रही है, ठीक है, अगर किसी की अटेंडेंस में मसला है मुझे फौरन बताए, खुदा ना खास्ता, देखो अटेंडेंस के नंबर हैं जो लाइव सेशन के नंबर हैं, ठीक है, तो किसी का मसला हो तो मुझे फौरन बताए। मैंने कल अटेंडेंस चेक की थी तो मैंने बाल लोगों का देखा कि वो 2 क्लासेस में एब्सेंट थे, तो उनकी 8 आउट ऑफ 10 आ रही थी, एक दो स्टूडेंट्स के, जो अपने आप चेक कर लें। बैकलॉग अटेंडेंस मिसिंग है, पोर्टल पे अटेंडेंस नहीं आ रही, इसका हल ये है कि आप फौरन अपने क्लास एडवाइजर से कहते हैं रब्ता कायम करें। क्लास एडवाइजर मिस बीनेश अभी पता नहीं शायद छुट्टी पर है, मुझे नहीं पता, राजा मसूद लारिक साहब से, राजा मसूद लारिक साहब से आप कहें कि ये सेकेंड ईयर क्लास एडवाइजर हैं लेकिन 1-2 दिन के लिए वो फर्स्ट ईयर का काम भी देख रहे हैं, तो इनसे आप कहें कि वो आपकी बैकलॉग की अटेंडेंस आपको पता नहीं सेंड करें या आपको बताएं, ये क्लास एडवाइजर बताता है, उनसे रब्ता करें, ये हमारे पोर्टल पे भी नहीं आती, पहले मतलब ये होता है। ठीक है, अटेंडेंस देखने के मार्क्स जी हैं, अच्छा देखो उसमें तरीका ये है कि ना तुम जाना और एक दफ़ा व्यू या प्ले पे क्लिक कर देना तो आपकी अटेंडेंस लग जाएगी, ठीक है, समझ आया, मतलब तो इवन दो अगर आप डाउनलोड करके बाद में देख रहे हो, एक दफ़ा प्ले पे क्लिक करना सबके लिए ज़रूरी है। सर कंप्लीट टू प्रोग्राम द प्रॉब्लम इज दैट द प्रोग्राम इज नॉट रनिंग कोड ब्लॉक व्हाइल रनिंग सक्सेसफुली है। कोड ब्लॉक में कंपाइलर कौन सा लगाया, पहली बात। दूसरा ये कि मैंने कहा था कोड ब्लॉक में वो वाला कोड ब्लॉक्स पे तुम जाओगे तो मैंने बताया था कि कौन सा आपको डाउनलोड करना है, इसके अंदर जो बिल्ट इन कंपाइलर है ना, डाउनलोड द बाइनरी रिलीज पे जाओगे और यहाँ पे देखो ये जो सेटअप है ना ये वाला, ये नहीं चलता, ये चलता है लेकिन इसके अंदर कंपाइलर नहीं है, कंपाइलर आप कुछ और लगाएंगे, ठीक है, तो यहाँ पे ये वाला जो सेटअप है ना जिसके अंदर मिन जी डब्ल्यू कंपाइलर है ये आपको चलाना है, ये वाला, ठीक है, जिसके अंदर कंपाइलर ऑलरेडी है, वरना फिर आप ना ये सेटअप चलाओगे, फिर मेन जी डब्ल्यू कंपाइलर आप अलग से डाउनलोड करोगे और फिर उसको इंक्लूड कराना पड़ता है, वो कुछ लोग नहीं कर पाते, वो लैब में उनको मुश्किल, लैब में नहीं मतलब क्लास में उनको मुश्किल होती है, तो इस वजह से हम कहते हैं भाई ये तीसरा वाला डाउनलोड कर लो, यही सबसे अच्छा है। ठीक है, अच्छा भाई वापस और क्या है, एक मिनट, टाइम पर रिकॉर्डेड लेक्चर, यार ये ना आप लोग जल्दी कर लें, अटेंडेंस क्लोज होने वाली है। ठीक है, अटेंडेंस मुझे नहीं पता कि, क्योंकि हाँ एक और बात सुन लो बेटा, तुम लोगों का वाइवा टेस्ट भी होगा, वो मैंने उसका शेड्यूल देखा हुआ है, लेकिन वो ऑफिशियल नहीं है, और हमें ये भी नहीं पता कि तुम लोगों की अगले हफ्ते के बाद क्लासेस होंगी कि नहीं होंगी, अपने क्लास एडवाइजर पूछना, किसी को नहीं पता चल रहा है कि क्लास है कि नहीं है। अभी तो लो इस हफ्ते तो हो गई, ठीक है, और इसके बाद वाले हफ्ते में भी हो जाएगी पहली को, लेकिन ये जो 7 वाला सितंबर वाला हफ्ता है ना, इस 7 सितंबर वाले हफ्ते में आप लोगों के वाइवा हैं, और वो वाइवा जो है ना वो हम रिटर्न ही लेंगे, और वो क्विज नंबर 1 से लेके 5 तक के ही क्वेश्चन से रिलेटेड आएगा। ठीक है, ये प्रॉपरली जब हम लोग आपको अनाउंस हो जाएगा तो फिर हम बताएंगे, लेकिन आप लोगों का, इसीलिए हम लोगों को ये कंफ्यूजन हो रही है, टीचर्स को हो रही है, और कोई हमें बताने में तैयार नहीं है, वो ये है कि हमें ये नहीं पता कि अगले हफ्ते के बाद क्लास होगी कि नहीं होगी। ठीक है, कहाँ गया, एक मिनट सॉरी, हम अगस्त में थे ना, अगले हफ्ता 25 और अगले हफ्ते 1 सितंबर हो जाएगी, और 7 सितंबर से क्लासेस वाइवा हैं आप लोगों के। तो जहां तक मुझे याद पड़ता है अनऑफिशियली हम लोगों का जो C++ का वाइवा जो था वो गालिबन पता नहीं कब था, शायद जुम्मे को था, या जो मुझे याद नहीं आ रहा, लेकिन वो अनऑफिशियल डेट मैंने देखी थी। ठीक है, तो वो साइन नहीं थी, वो जब वो साइन शेड्यूल आएगा तो पता चलेगा, वो पहले कुछ और आ रहा था, अब पता चल रहा है कि फाइनल एग्जाम्स और एंट्री टेस्ट भी उन्होंने आगे मूव कर दिया, तो मुझे नहीं पता इसका। ठीक है, चलो भाई, अब और किसी का सवाल पूछते हैं तो ठीक है। नहीं, वाइवा में ना क्विज नंबर 1 से लेके 5 तक के सवाल आएंगे, सही है, उससे रिलेटेड क्विज नंबर 1 से लेके 5 जो आप कर रहे हो ना, जो मेरे पीडीएफ फाइल्स हैं वो आएंगी, ये जो बिल्कुल ये समझ लो ये सेकंड लास्ट हमारी क्लास है, रिटर्न होगा जी जी जी, आपका ये गूगल फॉर्म्स पे ही होगा, सही है, गूगल फॉर्म्स पे ही होगा, और आपको वही 2 घंटे दिए जाएंगे, लेकिन उसमें सबको होना जरूरी है, जैसे आपका मिड टर्म हुआ था एग्जैक्टली उसी तरह का होगा, और वो सेशन रिकॉर्ड होगा, बिल्कुल सब सब चीजें जस्ट लाइक मिड टर्म। इफ यू कैन डू क्विज नंबर 1 to 5 यू कैन इजीली डू द वाइवा, नो प्रॉब्लम एट ऑल। ठीक है, अच्छा ठीक है, बाकी लोग अब साइन आउट कर जाएं, मेरे ख्याल में 9:42 हो गए हैं, आप लोग नेक्स्ट क्लास में जाना है। ठीक है फिर, एंड दैट्स इट, अल्लाह हाफिज। हाँ, क्विज के लिए पीडीएफ से तैयारी करनी है, दैट्स, ठीक है, पीडीएफ दी हुई तो है वो 1 से लेके 5 तक, वो वाली। ठीक है भाई, और कोई सवाल है तो लिख दो यहाँ पे, और बाकी फिर अल्लाह हाफिज। फिर यही होगा, असल में 14th वीक की डेफिनेशन हम लोगों को क्लियर नहीं हो रही कि यार ये 14 वीक है क्या। लग गई यार, लाल अब्दुल लग गई अटेंडेंस, टेंशन नहीं लो उसकी। अच्छा खैर, 4 सितंबर तक है ना वो, असल में ये वाला हफ्ता ना टीचिंग वीक था, और उन्होंने कहा था कि आपको 4 लैब्स लेनी है, 4 लैब्स तो हो ही नहीं रही, हमारी तो 3 लैब्स हो रही हैं भाई, पहली लैब 17 को, ये 25 को, ये फिर फर्स्ट को हो जाएगी, सॉरी 18-25 फर्स्ट को, और उसके बाद 8 तारीख आ रही है, इन्होंने यहाँ पे वाइवा रख दिया, तो ये 3 क्लासेस का वाइवा होगा, तो वो फिर आप लोगों का ये है कि क्विज नंबर 1 से लेकर 5 तक आप तैयारी कर लो, तो इंशाल्लाह आपका वाइवा भी अच्छा हो जाएगा। ठीक है।